everyone, I'm Nitsahone and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In this week's video, we'll be looking at burn spells, which is honestly something that is sort of surprising I haven't already done in over 100 of these. I actually thought I had done it, but when Lightning Helix made last week's video, I went to see where it ranked on the burn spells video and realized I hadn't actually done one yet. So, I have done worse burn spells, so it seems like the right time to look at the other end of the spectrum. In this video, we'll talk about the 10 burn spells that have made the biggest impact on Magic's competitive scene. I used a specific definition for burn spell in this video, just like I did in the worst burn spell video. Basically, a card has to be able to do damage to the opponent. In other words, a card did not have to also do damage to creatures to be considered burn for this list, but it did have to damage the opponent. However, every card that ended up making the list is capable of doing either, which makes sense, as the best burn spells are the flexible ones. Burn is sort of a signature ability for Red. It is the way that Red most frequently receives removal spells, and that has been the case since the very beginning of the game, and as a result, every card on this list is at least partly Red. Flavor-wise, these types of spells are representative of the ability of Red mages to conjure fire and lightning, which basically every burn spell ever printed features one or the other of in either name or in the art. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score cards for these lists. Pro Tour, Legacy, and Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, and Grand Prix top 8s are worth a single point. Now on to number 10. At number 10, we have a hyper-efficient sorcery that can split up its damage, and that is Forked Bolt. Burn spells that divide damage are usually pretty nice, and this one is super flexible for such a low mana cost. You can use it to do the last 2 damage to your opponent, to kill 2 X1s, to kill a 2/2, or to do damage to an X1 and damage your opponent. All of these options are fairly attractive depending on the state of the game, and as a result, Forked Bolt has seen a decent amount of play. In Standard, it primarily saw play in Jund and Red Deck Wins, and in Modern, it's seen play in Burn and Delver, and most recently in Mardu Pyromancer, all decks which want to play cheap instants and sorceries. However, Forked Bolt has been at its most powerful in formats where Delver of Secrets is the best, and that means Legacy. Delver decks want lots of cheap instants and sorceries, and Forked Bolt delivers there. In addition to Delver, it has also seen play in Canadian Threshold, where the low cost helps you get to Threshold faster, while also killing an opposing Delver of Secrets. The fact that it's good against Delver and in Delver has made it see a lot of play in Legacy. It's still actively seeing play in both Modern and Legacy right now, and I think it will move higher on this list as time goes on. At number 9, we have the only split card to make the list, Fire and Ice. If you thought Forked Bolt was flexible, Fire and Ice is even more so. Either half of this card, individually, would be nothing special and constructed. There are more efficient ways to do what these cards do. For example, Forked Bolt is actually cheaper than the Fire half of the card, granted it is a sorcery. But the fact that this gives you a choice of 2 different effects, both of which are very good, especially in control decks, makes it a heavily played card in multiple formats. In Standard, it saw play primarily in Psychotog control decks, but also in Squirrel, Opposition, and Blue-Green Madness. It amassed some pretty great numbers there, the most impressive of which being taking 4 of the top 8 slots at Worlds in 2002 and 5 of the top 8 slots at Grand Prix Taipei in the same year. It saw play in Extended too, primarily in control decks. One of the nastiest things to do with this card was to put it on Isochron's Scepter, meaning you got to make the choice between the 2 cards over and over again and cast it over and over again, which is a pretty painful thing to have to deal with. It also saw play in Extended Psychotog, Blue-Red Control, and Enduring Ideal decks in Extended. Fire and Ice has proven to be so powerful that it has even seen a lot of play in Legacy and Vintage in various control and mid-range decks, including Canadian Threshold, Blue-Red Delver, Landstill, and Monastery Mentor decks. Fire and Ice is still seeing play in Eternal formats, so it may be able to hold off Forked Bolt for now. At number 8, we have the second oldest burn spell on the list, and that is Incinerate. Originally printed in Ice Age, Incinerate might cost twice as much as Lightning Bolt, but it has the additional upside of making a creature unable to regenerate, which was a little more relevant in the olden days of Magic. Obviously, it is still no Lightning Bolt, but it has been a fixture in Standard all 3 times it has been printed, with the last 2 printings being in 10th edition in Magic 2012. This has allowed it to obtain a good spot on this list, despite the fact that it has never seen play in formats that aren't Block or Standard. It was part of the successful early aggro decks, including Sly and Red Deck Wins in Magic's early days, between 1995 and 1998. It found its way back into Standard in 2007, finding its way into newer versions of Red aggro decks, and it basically did the same thing when printed in Magic 2012, though it also found its way into Delver decks. We're going to say Delver a lot in this video. Unlike the 2 cards at 9 and 10, which aren't very far behind it, Incinerate hasn't seen play in a very long time, and it probably won't unless it gets reprinted again, so this card is very likely to fall off the list, maybe even in the next year or so. At number 7, we have a burn spell that made creatures who didn't like to stay in the graveyard stay dead, and that is Pillar of Flame. A sorcery speed shock is usually decent enough to see some play in Standard these days, but the additional upside on this one has proven to be relevant enough for it to make this list. In both block and standard, there were several creatures who didn't stay dead, the most prevalent of these probably being Gravecrawler, but it also dealt with creatures who had Persist, which were also an issue in standard at the time. The standard deck it was featured most heavily in was probably Delver, but it also saw play in more traditional control decks. It has seen play in Modern too, where the metagame has called for it, having made appearances in Burn and Delver decks between 2012 and 2015. This was a Modern format that featured combos involving Persist, so the Pillar fit in there. Eventually, that deck was weakened by the banning of Birthing Pod, and as a result, the Pillar hasn't seen play in Modern since 2015. At number 6, we have a burn spell that likes artifacts, Galvanic Blast. At worst, Galvanic Blast is shock, and at its best, when you can assemble Metalcraft, it's actually a better Lightning Bolt. There aren't many burn spells that can outmuscle Lightning Bolt in terms of efficiency and damage, but Galvanic Blast can do it in the right situation. Luckily for the Blast, artifact-heavy decks have been prevalent in many of Magic's formats, and those decks tend to run Galvanic Blast when they get the chance, since it's an upgraded Lightning Bolt. It saw play in block. Scars of Mirrodin block was an easy one to get Metalcraft in, and it put up 4 top 8s at that block Pro Tour. In Standard, it saw play even in decks that couldn't reliably turn on Metalcraft, because it turns out the shock part of this card is still pretty good. Lots of decks that were at least partly red ran it because it gave them an efficient way to destroy early creatures. This included aggressive decks, but also more mid-range decks like Kessig Ramp. In Modern, it has seen play in the artifact-heavy Affinity deck, which is one of the few decks that has been a Tier 1 deck from the day Modern began and has remained there ever since. And it's amassed a lot of points there, and it will continue to amass points in Modern Affinity decks. At number 5, we have a modal card where one of the options lets you burn stuff, and that is Kolaghan's Command. Easily the best of the command cycle from Dragons of Tarkir, Kolaghan's Command basically always guarantees you a 2-for-1 for only 3 mana. You can use it to make your opponent discard, get a creature back from your graveyard, destroy an artifact, or to do 2 damage to something, and that's where the burn part comes in. Basically, no matter which 2 you choose, though, you're going to get a 2-for-1. The options on modal cards like these are very powerful because they make the card good against basically all decks. Its power was realized pretty quickly, with it showing up all over in Standard in both aggro and control decks, including Mardu and Rakdos aggro, Jeskai midrange, and Grixis control. While it was certainly played with some regularity in Standard, it wasn't exactly an all-star there. Instead, it has been an important card in Modern. It has seen play there in Grixis Control and in Jund in the past, but both of those decks have seen a lot less play recently, and today it sees the most play in various Death Shadow decks, and it's going to continue to see play there. At number 4, we have what is actually a strictly worse Incinerate, and that's Lightning Strike. While it may be worse than Incinerate, the difference between the two isn't much these days. They both have very similar resumes too. Both were printed more than once and heavily played in Standard during every reprint, but neither has ever managed to show up in other formats, where cards like Lightning Bolt really upstage it. During Theros Standard, it saw play in various Devotion decks. Those were the decks that sort of define that format, as well as in Boros aggro and Mono Red aggro. These days, it is part of arguably the 2 best decks in Standard, Mono Red aggro and Rakdos aggro. Lightning Strike is still legal in Standard now, thanks to a reprint in Ixalan, and it's going to put up more points before it rotates out of Standard. At number 3, we have the only burn spell to make this list that also gains you life, and that is Lightning Helix. Basically, Lightning Bolt and Healing Salve stapled together, the Helix has seen a ton of play over the years. Being able to cause a 6-point life swing with your opponent or killing a creature and gaining life at the same time is excellent. It saw surprisingly little play in block and Standard, at least when compared to formats with larger card pools. While there was a Boros aggro deck in Standard where it saw most of its play, it needed formats with a larger critical mass of burn spells and highly efficient creatures to shine. At first, this was extended. This included various versions of Red Deck Winds, Boros aggro, and Zoo, and it also transitioned to Modern, arguably becoming an even more relevant card there. Zoo decks in the early days were pretty much ported to Modern, but it has also seen play in more dedicated burn decks, as well as various Jeskai control decks. Zoo was even good in Legacy once, and Lightning Helix was part of its success there between 2010 and 2011. At number 2, we have arguably the second most iconic burn spell of all time, and that is Shock. Lightning Bolt is obviously the gold standard of removal spells, but Wizards eventually realized that it was a little bit overpowered for healthy Standard formats, so when Stronghold came out, they debuted a new burn spell that would take its place for a while, and that was Shock, which, for a while, was the burn spell you expected to see reprinted in core sets. So it has been legal in many Standard formats. It does 1 less damage than the Bolt, but Shock is still a good card. I mean, Lightning Bolt's an incredible card. You can't always expect Lightning Bolt. It was also printed in Onslaught block and was pretty good in Onslaught block constructed because it was good against the dominant Goblin decks and good in them, and as a result, most decks that made the top 8 at the Block Pro Tour ran some number of Shocks. It had some modest success in Extended, picking up a couple of Grand Prix top 8s in aggro burn style decks, but Standard has been its primary home over the years. In the late 90s, it was part of various aggressive red decks, including Burn, Sly, and Zoo. In 2007, it saw play in Dragonstorm, and in Theros Standard, it saw play alongside Lightning Strike in most cases. Most recently, it has found its way in Vehicles decks and Ramonap Red before that deck kind of got banned. Like Lightning Strike, it is still legal in Standard right now thanks to a printing in Aether Revolt, and it is played alongside Lightning Strike in the red decks dominating Standard right now. At number 1, we have the card that everyone expected. One that in the 120 or so top 10s I have done has the second highest score ever behind only Thoughtseize, and that is of course the original burn spell, the best burn spell ever printed, Lightning Bolt. There's kind of a funny story about this one before we get to talking about the card. As I was calculating its incredibly huge and time-consuming score, a thunderstorm came in and knocked my power out, and I lost all the calculations I had done, and that's just pretty funny that I was doing that with Lightning Bolt, and lightning basically caused my power to go out. But anyway, I've mentioned Lightning Bolt a lot in this video, and that is because it is the gold standard for what a burn spell is. Lightning Bolt is the most efficient burn spell ever. While cards like Galvanic Blast can sometimes do even more damage for a single mana, they ask for a lot of setup. Lightning Bolt just does 3 all the time, every time, no matter what kind of deck you have. With Lightning Bolt, it really doesn't matter what kind of deck you're playing, whether it's aggro or control, or what format you're playing. If your deck has red in it and Lightning Bolt is legal, you should probably be running 4 of them. It has seen play every single year since its original printing in Alpha, and it is one of the very few cards that can make such a claim. Being one of the very first Magic cards and the best burn spell ever has allowed it to amass an insane score of over 400 points. This is the kind of card that we don't really need to talk about the history of in any sort of detail, because it is just so ubiquitous across all the formats in Magic. Suffice it to say that Lightning Bolt will never be dethroned as the most powerful burn spell in the history of the game. Well, that does it for this week. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.